and welcome to all of you on the line today. I hope everyone is well and that you and your families continue to stay healthy and safe. We're grateful to have you joining us for today's Fighting Hate from Home webinar, Combating Domestic Terrorism 1 year after El Paso. For today's call, ADL CEO and National Director Jonathan Greenblatt will be speaking with our panelists to discuss the El Paso attack, the spread of hate, and the fight against domestic terrorism. And now to introduce our panelists. Ambassador Martha Bárcena was appointed Mexican ambassador to the United States in 2018, becoming the first female ambassador to hold this position. Ambassador Bárcena has represented Mexico as a delegate at the United Nations, UNESCO, and the Organization of American States, as well as Mexico's head of delegation at the Forum on Migration and Development. Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, a third-generation El Pasoan, represents Texas' 16th congressional district, making history as the first woman elected to this seat. She serves on the House Judiciary Committee and Armed Services Committee and has established herself as a national leading voice on immigration, leading legislation to address our nation's immigration challenges in a responsible and humane manner. Sindy Benavides is a Honduran-American immigrant who has experienced the American dream and now devotes her career to ensuring that young people, women, and immigrants have the same opportunity. She heads the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, the oldest Hispanic civil rights organization in the country, and has been named one of the top Latina women of excellence by Hispanic Business Magazine. We are honored to be joined by such a distinguished panel of women for this important conversation. And at this time, it's my pleasure to turn the call over to you, Jonathan. Oh, you're on mute. There we go.
Thank you so much, Deb. Hello, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today for what's a somber anniversary, but I believe we're going to take strength from the discussion we're about to have with, as Deb said, an incredible panel of leaders. Just over a year ago, on August the 3rd, 2019, a white supremacist drove more than 11 hours from Dallas down to El Paso to murder Latinos, Mexicans, and immigrants. This man opened fire at a Walmart where families and communities members were doing their back-to-school shopping. He intentionally targeted that location. He told the police who detained him that he, quote, wanted to kill as many Mexicans as possible. Like other white supremacist shooters, he posted a manifesto online before he committed the attack, where he claimed it as, quote, a response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas, and said that he was merely defending his country from, quote, cultural and ethnic replacement brought on by an invasion. The shooter took the lives of 23 people and he injured 23 more, making it one of the deadliest domestic terror attacks in American history and one of the deadliest hate crimes as well. It was also the most murderous attack against the Latino community in the US in modern history. The tragedy of El Paso 1 year ago came at a time when hate crimes and violence against minorities and marginalized communities and people of color have been on the rise. We saw it then and we see it now. From Charlottesville to Muncie, from Pittsburgh to Charleston, and frankly around the world. From Halle to Christchurch. Members of the Latinx, immigrant, Jewish, Muslim, and Black communities continue to be the targets of hate. This resurgence of hate, especially the racist anti-immigrant hate that was behind this El Paso attack, it's been fomented by our country's leaders actively mainstreaming racism and bigotry. It's created an environment where Americans are afraid that they will be murdered in their house of worship, shot to death in their supermarket, or assaulted simply walking down the street. For more than a century, ADL has been battling anti-Semitism and working to secure justice and fair treatment to all people. Our founders believed that Jews in this country couldn't be safe unless all people were safe. And that commitment still drives the ADL 107 years later. This mission binds us to fight hate in all forms, and to support those communities, particularly communities of color, affected by hate and violent extremism. The El Paso attack was a defining moment for the Latinx community, and ADL immediately took notice and sought ways to support our Latinx brothers and sisters, hermanos y hermanas, in a time of need. We stood in solidarity with the El Paso community, with our partner civil rights organizations, including LULAC, and I'm so glad Sindy's joining us today, as well as Unidos US and MALDEF, Voto Latino, and so many others. We also stood with members of Congress, immigrant rights groups, and our partners in the Mexican government and their consular network across the United States. We intensified hate crime training to support the Latinx community and to deliver information on anti-immigrant extremists. And we cooperated and coordinated our advocacy and worked together for legislation to curb the threat of white supremacist violence, such as the Jabara Hire No Hate Act or the Disarm Hate Act and the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, all of which we can talk about with Congresswoman Escobar, and the training we're doing with Mexican consulates with the ambassador. Look, at ADL, we've been tracking and exposing the rise in hateful rhetoric, hate crimes and bias incidents, particularly those targeting immigrants and Latinos. Under the Memorandum of Understanding that we signed with the government of Mexico, literally it's almost 2.5 years ago, ADL has trained more than 2,000 Mexican consular staff and community leaders across the country. And we will continue this work, and we will continue to fight hate together. There's so many questions I want to ask, and I know we've got a lot of people in the queue, watching the Zoom, who probably also want to ask questions. But before I do that, I'd like to ask each of our three panelists to begin by sharing where you were on August the 3rd, 2019, when the El Paso attack occurred, and how it's impacted you and your community over these past 12 months. Congresswoman, if I might, why don't we start with you?
Well, first, Jonathan, I want to thank you so much, you and the ADL, for hosting this conversation. It is so important that we mark this 1-year anniversary and that we reflect on what brought us to that moment on August 3rd, 2019, and what has happened or not happened since then. It's a pleasure to be here with Sindy and with the Embajadora. And thanks so much to all of you who are tuning in and who care deeply about these issues. So Jonathan, to answer your question, I was in El Paso. We had, it was a Saturday morning, and the 3 days preceding August 3rd, I had colleagues of mine from Congress here in El Paso for 3 days of a border congressional delegation visit. It had been, I think, my 12th. At that point, I had brought 20% of Congress to the border, to El Paso, because of all of the atrocities that we had seen at the hands of the administration. I wanted my colleagues to see what was happening firsthand. I wanted them to talk to refugees and asylum seekers. So it was 3 incredible days that Friday I had said goodbye to many of them, taken them to the airport, said goodbye. The next morning, I had a town hall meeting. And I was at a town hall meeting, and I will tell you, my mom normally shops at Walmart on weekends. Thank God she was in the audience that day with me. But I was having my town hall meeting, and a staff member walked up. We had just finished my presentation. We had begun the Q&A section of it. She took the microphone from my hand and she said, "Congresswoman, there's an active shooter." And she described the part of town. And she said, "We have to send everybody home because law enforcement needs to get to the site of the attack." And so I tried as calmly as possible to tell people to go home, to be safe, raced over to my office downtown to try to get more information. And I will tell you, for that whole drive from the town hall meeting at a local high school to my office downtown, I was just praying that it was an active shooter who had been apprehended, who was unable to injure anyone, who had not harmed anyone. And then as we got the news throughout the day, it just became more and more crushing and devastating. And it is a wound that is still wide open today.
So hard. And you know, your story reminds me of the Saturday morning when I heard about the Pittsburgh shooting. It sounds, the echoes are real and chilling. Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm going to go next to you, Sindy, if you would, to talk a little bit about where you were that day, how it's affected your community and LULAC in general.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you again to the entire ADL team for all that you do to combat hate for good. And gosh, what an honor to be here with Congresswoman Escobar and with the ambassador, who I admire so much. I feel like all of us share a lot of firsts, unfortunately still in 2020. And I will tell you that El Paso for us, it's something similar to 9/11, right? Like where we always remember where we were during that day and during that time. And El Paso happened shortly after our national convention in Milwaukee. I happened to be at an allies actually convention happening in San Diego. And so I remember I was in the living room of one of my Anichila hermanas. We were, discussing Latino issues and strategizing and thinking just so much of the work ahead. And I remember just, how my heart just fell to the floor. LULAC has its second headquarters in El Paso, and we've had our second headquarters there for over 2 decades. And so El Paso for us, it's close to home. We not only have staff members who live and work in El Paso, we have LULAC members who live and work in El Paso, we have a private community who lives and work in El Paso. And I remember, Jonathan, actually you and so many other leaders reached out to me, gave me a personal call to check in and see how we were doing. And I will never forget that, because I think it also shows you that at a time of despair, at a time when we see the worst in America, we come together and we unite. And, for our community, Jonathan, the best way I could describe it is that we felt that for the very first time, very blatantly, our ethnicity was being used as a weapon against us. And the fact was that someone drove 6 hours away into this very peaceful community, one of the safest in the country, to intentionally kill individuals that were perceived as Mexican, individuals who were Latinos, individuals who were brown. And for us, that is absolutely a crime. We also know, Jonathan, that for the last 3+ years, we have seen a heavy rhetoric in America like nothing else before, where it's okay to call Mexican rapist, and that is completely unacceptable. Where it's okay to call our Latino community invaders, when we know, especially those who love history and study the history of our country, that before Texas was Texas, it was Texas. And before Colorado was Colorado, it was Colorado. And before New Mexico was New Mexico, it was Nuevo Mexico. And so I think for us, it's so important that we reframe the narrative that is being created to understand that Latinos have always been an integral part of America from the very beginning. Gracias.
So powerful. Thank you for that, Sindy. I'm grateful. And I do remember that day calling you, and I do remember being in touch with you. And I think your points about the way Latinx and particularly Mexicans and Mexican Americans have been denigrated and defamed by the president and by the people around him is disgusting. And we'll talk about that at length, just what a dangerous precedent it is. Now, I think it's really appropriate, Madam Ambassador, to come to you, because I do think this is a domestic issue and it's a foreign policy issue. This is an American problem, but it has global implications, no more so than with our largest trading partner, no more so than with our neighbor to the south, no more so than a country that we've had great relations for generations until now. Talk to us a little bit about where you were on that day. Talk to us a little bit about now about what it's meant. I'm curious for Mexicans in diaspora here in the United States, but also for the people in Mexico itself. help us if you would give us some context.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. And I really appreciate the invitation to be here today with my great friend, Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, and also my great friend, Sindy Benavides. I will tell you, I was out of the country because I had just become a grandmother. So I was visiting my granddaughter who had 14 days old of having been born. So when I heard about El Paso, my immediate thought was, oh my God, into which kind of world is she coming to? How are we going to deal with these challenges? How are we going to educate her to deal with these issues? And then I immediately relate myself to a horrible experience that was very similar to El Paso, which was the attack of Anders Breivik on the island of Utoya against his own people when I was ambassador to Norway. So I immediately made the relationship and said, I mean, this is again another act that is the result of hate and of a hate that doesn't have any rationality, because you cannot have any explanation for this kind of hate. It's really something irrational and visceral, and that it's animated by a wrong perception of reality and of a lack of knowledge of so many issues. But it is basically an ethics issue. It is a total lack of respect for the human life, for the sanctity of life. So this El Paso attack was really the shocking realization of a hate crime in the US that we have not seen against Mexican population before, and that reflected very well how white supremacism and racism can beget violence on a horrific scale. And it was the deadliest, and it has been the deadliest attack against Latino and the Mexican community. And of course, it had an immediate impact in the Mexican community across the US as in Mexico. And I wanted to take this on what Veronica said and Sindy said, which is that there is this, in some circles of these white supremacists, a total lack of knowledge of what Mexico, the Mexicans, and the Latinos means to the US. As Sindy said, Texas was Texas. I mean, so how can you even think that someone is coming to invade Texas when Mexicans were there before anyone arriving from somewhere else? Native Americans were there. And how in places like El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, we have been one society. Even before Ciudad Juarez was called Ciudad Juarez, it was called Paso del Norte. So El Paso and Paso del Norte, like in all this. So we have always conceived the border and El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, Tijuana, San Diego, as a whole society. So how could this take place? So the first question to me was, is this something really done by someone from El Paso? And it was clear it wasn't, because I think someone for El Paso could have never done something like this from the border, because it's a whole different understanding. And then of course, my thought and the thought in Mexico, all the articles, the people that call at the people at the embassies, how this, what is the purpose of this terrible attack? And then we of course were very worried to see that this growing anti-immigrant rhetoric in which you paint the immigrants as the enemy, the other as the enemy, it really reinforcing the worst of the society. And that we had to work very hard to counteract those trends. And I remember, if my memory does not fail me, Jonathan, that we spoke on the phone.
We did.
Some hours after the attack, and that we talked about how terrible it has been, but we also talked about what we had to do for the future to avoid a repetition of these kind of acts. Because also I remember, and I was very shocked that one of my brothers, who is an American citizen and lives in Tucson, he was in El Paso those days. And he called me and said, you know, one of the women that lost her life, he is the wife of one of my best friends. And so I felt also the attack on El Paso in a very personal way, because I knew that it was affecting people that were known directly by my family, by some of my brothers. And that this is something that really goes into the deep of your soul and said, what do I have to do to avoid something like this occurring again?
It's hard. It's very hard. You have my sympathies to your brother and his friend's family and to all of you. And I think the crime has a particularly difficult impact, you know, on the Latinx community. I want you to know, though, as an American, I feel it too. And as a reminder, I didn't know about your service in Norway, but it's funny. I mean, it reminds us that white supremacy is a global terror threat. We've got to take it as seriously. And in fact, I would say more seriously in some way than others, because it's right here at our doorstep. From Andres Breivik to the shooter in El Paso, it's a real problem. There are a lot of questions I have. If I might, I'm going to start with you, Congresswoman. Can you talk a little bit about some of the political reverberations of El Paso? How do you think it's changed, you know, the public conversation, specifically in Washington or more broadly, and maybe specifically among Latino voters or the broader Latino community?
Well, and Jonathan, I think it's important to talk about also how things have not changed. But preceding the attack, you know, I can tell you, and I've shared with others, that I had long feared that we were going to be the target of an attack. My fear was that it would be an attack against the migrants, actually. And we know that for the last few years, and actually in years preceding the last few years, immigrants have been an easy scapegoat. Immigrants have been targeted as a sort of, they've been identified as a problem to be solved. And this administration, through its policies, starting with family separation, continuing with incredibly inhumane holding facilities for immigrants, where immigrants are we're put behind a chain link fence in my community, forced to sleep on rocks under an overpass in 100-degree heat for weeks on end, to policies that continue today, expulsions, including expulsions of children, expulsions of infants. We have not seen this kind of dehumanization of immigrants, at least not in my lifetime. This is the kind of dehumanization of immigrants that we thought was relegated to dark places in history that unfortunately are taking place in front of our very eyes in my community on American soil. And so preceding the attack, the rhetoric by the president, by my governor, and by some of the leaders with the most powerful bully pulpits in the land, essentially helped strip immigrants of their humanity in the eyes of many Americans. And, you know, so that day, as I was thinking about, in the weeks that followed, as I was visiting with families and hearing the stories firsthand and really in vivid detail that I will never forget about what they witnessed inside that Walmart, I kept thinking, he could not have seen these beautiful souls as humans. He had to have seen them as inhuman in order to be able to have the power to slaughter them, in order to have the motivation to slaughter them. And so, you know, we've got to think about what preceded that moment. And since then, really, there's so much that has not changed in terms of the policies by the administration. You know, there was a very painful article recently in ProPublica this week about the expulsions that are taking place of unaccompanied minors, children as young as 8 months old. It is unconscionable cruelty. And so you cannot think of migrants as humans when you allow that to happen. So our own government continues in the atrocities that we're seeing in the public policy coming from this administration, and specifically the Department of Homeland Security. Now, in terms of the politics among the Latino community, you know, Sindy talked about how this is our 9/11. That is not hyperbole, and that is not an exaggeration. I can tell you, in the months after the attack, one of the hardest things for me to talk about, and I apologize for getting emotional, it's so close to the heels of that anniversary. And so I've been, you know, visiting with a lot of the families and survivors, and so it's still very raw. But it is very heartbreaking to have young people tell me in tears that they can't believe that the color of their skin makes them a target. And the reason that the color of our skin has made us a target is because people in power have painted that target on our back. So, you know, my hope is that young people especially realize that we have an obligation to change that. We have the power to change that. We have the power to remove people from positions of authority who are racist and who use xenophobia and racism to fuel their own political agenda in order to get reelected, in order to divide our country. You know, that the rhetoric that is being used, the policies that are being implemented, they are consequential beyond the impact that they're making on the individuals who are targets. The consequences are far-reaching. We are a more divided country than ever before. We are a country that is in deep pain. And we are a country in need of reconciliation and a reconnection to who we are and to love. You know, just a week ago, I was sitting in the Capitol as we began to lay our beloved John Lewis to rest, and he was going to be laid in state in the rotunda, and there was a beautiful, incredible ceremony that preceded that. And I was sitting there with my colleagues and with his family and friends, and there was an incredible moment. Speaker Pelosi gave an introduction, and then she literally introduced Congressman Lewis. She said, "I yield to our colleague, Congressman Lewis," and through those speakers was his beautiful booming voice. And it was a recording of one of his commencement speeches where he talked about his own journey and the opportunities and the beauty and the hardship of his life. And in the end, he reminded us, we all live in the same house, whether we are African American, whether we are Latino, whether we are Asian, Native American, whether we are in America or not, whether we are documented or undocumented, we all live in the same house. We all deserve the dignity of being treated with respect and kindness and generosity and goodwill. And our country has lost its way. And there are leaders who have led us down that path, but we do have an obligation to take ourselves off that path and find a better one. We have the power to do it, and I know that we can. I have the hope that we can.
You're here. Thank you for, there's a lot to chew on in what you shared. It's a hard topic. Sindy, you know, thinking about what the Congresswoman said in this, and again, your comment being the 9/11, but over the last year, we've seen some 150,000 Americans die of COVID-19, in particular, last 6 months, sorry, in particular, people of color and people from the Latinx community. So how does that sort with this moment now? I mean, I just feel like as an observer looking that the community is really struggling with these twin challenges of the racism that Congresswoman Escobar talked about and the health and economic consequences of COVID-19. What's the mood like on the ground?
I will tell you, Jonathan, and we're so proud of Congresswoman Escobar. We love you so much because you're such a strong leader for El Paso, and we're just, you know, we're happy to see that the world can see the leadership that you have always displayed as an elected official and even as a leader in El Paso. And for us, Jonathan, as we look at COVID-19, there's no doubt that not only in the last few weeks, in the last few months, in the last few years, Latinos have been scapegoated. Even as we know from Surgeon General Adams that 5 out of 6 Latinos have to leave their houses every single day to work and get paid. Latinos are the essential workers of America. We are the community that is keeping America running. We are 1/4 of all grocery store workers. We are more than 40% of the workers in the meat packing industry. And as everyone knows, we have been not only fighting OSHA, the White House, and the corporations to make sure that they're providing those essential PPE to our workers so that they are not contracting COVID-19. We are also very cognizant that many Latinos serve as doctors, as nurses, as technicians, as janitors in our hospitals and clinics. And we know, Jonathan, because Latinos right now make up close to 32% of all COVID cases, though we're 18% of the population, that those numbers continue to rise. What individuals need to understand again is that we are the essential workers, and because we have to leave our houses, 5 out of 6 of us have to leave our houses every single day to work and get paid, we are exposed to COVID-19 at higher levels. And in fact, we know that in certain counties, in certain cities, we are even more disproportionately impacted. And I'll give you the example of my own home county of Fairfax County, Virginia, where we're 16.2 of the population, but we're over 60% of all COVID cases. And so there's so much more that needs to be done. And what I see happening, Jonathan, is that Latinos under this administration is trying to make us invisible by deporting our immigrant community, invisible by not having any Latino represented in the White House Health Task Force, invisible by not having any Latinos represented even at the state level in the different COVID task forces that exist. And there are many states that don't have Latinos represented. And so our question is, you know, how can you really grapple with the causes if you don't have our voice represented at the table to make sure that these decisions and that the solutions that are being carried out integrate our community, integrate what's happening on the ground. The truth is, Jonathan, that what we've seen in the last year is this administration scapegoating our community. And I just want to make it very clear. The Latino community, for many of our community, they are US-born citizens. They are multi-generational Latinos who have been here before parts of America were parts of the United States of America. And within the Latino community, you have an immigrant community. And what we've seen, Jonathan, and it's, you know, it's really interesting because, You know, what we're seeing in Portland, Oregon, where you have unmarked vehicles, we have already been seeing that in our immigrant community, where you have unmarked ICE vehicles pulling into our communities and taking away the parents and taking away the workers. So this is not something new in America. It's been happening for several years. We also know that language matters. The language that is utilized by our elected officials matters because they lead to action. And the fact is, but for so many years, Jonathan, our community has been dehumanized in ways that are so blatantly racist and ways that are so blatantly connected to white supremacy. And I think it will take all of us, absolutely every single one of us, to denounce this type of rhetoric, to denounce this type of speech. And, you know, I just find it appalling that even on some networks, we have individuals from the far right who are boasting about, you know, what is being stated on social media platforms. It's almost as if you're giving white supremacy the wink wink and the pat on the back, when really, in fact, we need our elected leaders to come out strong, to denounce immediately these actions. It is not okay to target anyone because of race, because of their religion, because of their gender, because of who they choose to love, and because of their nationality or the language that they speak. And the fact is, Jonathan, that what we see is tactics of divisiveness, tactics of fear. And our community is living in fear at this moment, living in fear that we will get deported, living in fear now with the census date being moved 1 month before it should have been moved, that we will not be counted. And, you know, again, this goes to the narrative of making the Latino community and making the immigrant community and making communities of color invisible in America. And so we have a lot of work to do. I think, you know, as I see some of the chats and the question, you know, when they attack any one of our communities, they attacked all of us. And so as we see these things occur, and I know just on August 2nd, we saw the sign of "Go back to Mexico" in Peach County, Georgia. I can tell you our community there is living in fear. And so we want to make sure that as a civil rights organization, Jonathan, we continue to live our mission of protecting and defending our community. And we will stand with everyone to make sure that we denounce, we call it to its face, that we are vocal, that we're not silent, and that we unite in this very important moment.
Bravo, Sindy. Thank you for your passion and your purpose and your focus. And I think we at ADL and everyone from our community stands with you 100%. I mean, and I will say this, you know, the attack on the Latinx community, whether it's articulated from the podium in the press briefing room at the White House, or it's shots fired at the parking lot of a Walmart, it's not just an attack on the Latinx community, it's an attack on us as American Jews. It's an attack on all of us as Americans. You know, the white supremacists and those who espouse the kind of toxic racism that they do, they hate exactly what is great about this country, and they threaten all of us. So, you know that we stand with you, you know, from start to finish. There are a bunch of questions in the queue. I would like to go to the ambassador, but Deb, do we have a question from the queue that we can direct, you know, maybe to start with Ambassador Bárcena before we open it up to everyone?
Absolutely, and thanks to all of you. If you've been looking at the chat at all, you've seen the gratitude that is pouring in for the extraordinary work that all of you are doing and for the leadership that you've shown. So I'll add my voice to that too, so thank you for that. Ambassador, why don't we start with you? And actually, you know, this is probably a question that we can ask to all of our panelists, but specifically, the El Paso attack really occurred only a few months after you became ambassador to the US. Maybe you can speak a little bit to how that colored your view of the job and how it might have shifted the priorities of your office. And I'd be curious to hear from each of you about how domestic extremism in general affects your work and your priorities and how you hope to address it moving forward. So Ambassador, why don't we start with you?
Yes, thank you, Deb. I'm really very much impressed by the passion of Sindy and Veronica, and I share that passion with them. And I would say, how did it change since I arrived? You know, the protection of rights of Mexicans in the US has been always a priority of the network of 50 consulates and the embassy. So what changed after El Paso? I think it shifted the sense of urgency. And also it made us think in what do we have to do, for example, and you will think this is a little bit crazy, but you know what was one of the first reactions after the attack, and that we thought, my goodness, do you imagine the amount of Mexicans that go each day to one of the biggest Mexican consulate generals? Those consulates can be the target of an attack. So, I mean, we contacted almost immediately the FBI and said, what do we do? I mean, do we keep the consulates open? How do we continue to work? And at the same time, we didn't want to increase the fear of the Mexican community, which feels that the consulates are their home and that they can feel safe there. So even to reach a balance on how to be protected in case of an attack, and we had some training courses with FBI in case of active shooting. So that was, for example, one of the things that you could see change immediately. Now we are working half a speed because of COVID. But that was, for example, one thing immediately, thinking that the embassy and the consulates could be a target of an attack if someone wanted to replicate El Paso. Then second is, how do we really fight the possibility of another attack, and how do we fight hate speech, and how do we train people to identify the hate crimes? And that is when the MOU that the Mexican government signed with ADL was so important, to train people to identify the hate crimes, because sometimes people do not realize that they are being subject of a hate speech. They just think, well, you know, this is the way they talk to us normally. No, that is not the way you shouldn't be talked at. So this was very important. But then how to transit from identifying of these hate speeches to legal processes, which is not so easy to do. Yes, and how do you then prosecute the persons that are really into this hate speech? No, I mean, Mexicans attacked on the street saying, because you're Mexicans, because you have to go back to Mexico because we don't need you. So that is another issue. But then how do you deal with this cyber hate in the social networks? And this is something that, of course, we're following very closely on the decisions that are taken here. And something that I want to share with you, you know, of all these manifesto of Crucius after the attack, I remember, and I think that the part that impressed me more is the part that he wrote that, just saying, before these Latinos and Mexican, they used to do gardening or menial jobs, but now they are educated and they are competing with me to get good jobs. And I thought, my goodness, what do immigrants and Mexicans and Latinos have to do to earn respect? Because even if you are attacked when you are better, when you are more educated, when you are contributing better to the society, and you are attacked precisely for that, then what is the way forward? So do you really conceive us as almost as your slaves to do the gardening and menial jobs? And you know, and in a way it is reflected up to a way, and I'm very proud of the work that they are doing now with COVID, in which the majority of essential workers are Latino workers, Mexican workers. We have lost almost 2,000 Mexicans in the US for COVID. And they were workers in the restaurant services, they were workers in the agricultural sector, they were workers in the meatpacking industry. We were working very closely with LULAC in with different consulates to identify the malpractices that were not protecting the meatpacking industry, and the dreamers. We have to remember that almost 300,000 dreamers have been in the first line of the sanitary services in COVID and hospital services. So this hunger for respect is still there in the Latino and in the Mexican community. And I think in general, the Latino and the Mexican community has worked very hard to earn this respect. Being agricultural workers, meat packing, younger generations getting studies, until we arrived as, you know, persons like Sindy and Congresswoman Escobar that represent the best of the Latino community in the US. But this is something that really gave us at the embassy, the consulates, and a sense of urgency of putting more emphasis on telling the US, listen, we have been here for many years, even centuries. We are the great contributors to the US society and the US economy. And even since before, but with El Paso attack, I think the motto of all my actions as Mexican ambassador to the US is to say, the future of the US is intrinsically linked to the future of Mexicans in the US. And you cannot conceive a future for the US without Mexicans and without the Latino communities. And we are an essential part of the future of this country. And if we get the US society to recognize these enormous contributions, I will feel that when I leave the US, I will feel that I have done my job. If the Latino community and the Mexican community gets all the respect and recognition that we deserve.
Thank you for that. That was a powerful answer. Congresswoman, maybe you can speak for a moment about how domestic terrorism has really influenced the work that you've been doing.
I think, Deb, we have to recognize what happened in El Paso, which was identified by or labeled by the FBI as a domestic terrorist attack. We have to recognize these domestic terrorist attacks as not just an attack against my community, our community, not just a tragedy for El Paso, but we have to recognize these things as national tragedies. We have to take ownership over them in the same way that you know, as Sindy mentioned, 9/11, that these are American tragedies and moments for reflection and a moment to pause and recognize where we are in our history. So how did it influence my work? Immediately after that, I asked the House Judiciary Committee, of which I'm privileged to be a member, to have a field hearing. We had actually been working on a field hearing in El Paso for some time about everything that was happening in El Paso with regard to the refugees that were arriving at our front door. But we shifted the topic and expedited the field hearing in order to talk about anti-immigrant language and its impact on domestic terrorism. And it also really just renewed my commitment to gun violence prevention legislation. You know, the gun that the killer used, the AK-47, was intended to have bullets not that would shoot through bodies, but that would destroy and obliterate bodies. And so my community, the survivors, are still dealing with intense physical pain in addition to the intense emotional and mental health pain, because those bullets that went into their legs or their stomachs or their backs or their hands didn't just destroy bone, it shattered bone, it shattered nerve endings, it shattered muscle. That's what AK-47s do. These are guns that have absolutely there's no reason for this kind of weapon to be in our neighborhoods. So it renewed my commitment for safe communities. But overall, Deb, it also, we read about these attacks in communities, but what we don't read enough about is the lingering impact long after. I am deeply worried still for my community's mental health. I am deeply worried for every one of the individuals that was inside that Walmart and walked out of it. The images and the sounds and what they still carry with them, they can never unsee that. They can never unhear that. There are young children who were in that Walmart who are deeply traumatized. Family members of those individuals are deeply traumatized. And my community is going through what mental health experts have told me is compound trauma. First, the incredible inhumanity by the Trump administration with regard to immigrants. El Paso was ground zero. Then the August 3rd shooting. And then, as Sindy laid out, the disproportionate impact of COVID on Latinos. In my community, in El Paso, we have seen some of the highest per capita deaths in the state of Texas, which has been a hot spot for months. And so, that there is incredible pain that the community still shoulders. And I believe that the federal government, in the absence of any kind of gun violence legislation activity by the Senate, even after bill after bill after bill that we've passed in the House, and in the wake of a president that fuels hatred, the federal government needs to step up and appropriate more resources for mental health treatment, appropriate more resources for healthcare. And our community is also going to shoulder the financial burden of prosecuting the killer. It will cost millions of dollars. Those are, can you imagine that after suffering what El Paso suffered through, then the fact that we shoulder the financial burden of prosecuting the man that slaughtered our people? That this is, the country should be up in arms about what is happening in our communities, including in El Paso, especially in El Paso, where we found ourselves at the crossroads of not just our country's gun violence epidemic, but our country's hate epidemic as well. That's the work that I'm focused on, Deb, in Congress, is fighting for those resources, for that help, for that support for my community. But it should be a mission for all of us.
Thank you. I agree. It's a shared responsibility. And Sindy, how about you? How has LULAC changed direction or priority when confronting this kind of extremism?
So, as we looked at what happened in El Paso, Deb, for one, we look at numbers, right? This is where tracking data and the work that ADL does is so important, because data drives policy. And what we know is that since 2018, hate crimes against Latinos has been up by 21%. We know that there were about 671 victims, and we actually think that this is a massive undercount, because we know that the majority of Latinos and the immigrant community do not report hate crimes. And again, there's a high level of distrust, and there's also a high level of fear that is occurring. At LULAC, we have this motto that's called all for one and one for all. And that's been our motto since 1929, when our community had to protect each other from the Texas Rangers who would hang, who would lynch them, who would kill them without ever there being a sense of justice. And what we know for sure, Deb, is that since El Paso happened for us, we have intentionally double down our efforts to work with ADL. In fact, just 2 days ago, we did a training with Monica Bauer from ADL to train our own LULAC members on what is white supremacy, how do you confront hate speech, how do we know the distinction, how do you make sure that as a witness, you record everything that you see, even what the symbols may mean, so that you're able to pass this on to law enforcement, or contact your consulate, or contact LULAC, or contact a trusted source. And so for us, that's very, very important. I can also tell you we're in direct contact with the FBI because we want to make sure that we strengthen that relationship, understanding that we need to be at the table to make sure that that we are taken into account. And I will also tell you that, and I feel Representative Escobar made this point, what has not happened? What has not happened is gun restrictions. And I will tell you that within LULAC, we have hunters who are avid about their Second Amendment rights, and we respect that. But the truth is that no individual should have a semi-automatic weapon, a weapon of war, to go to their local Walmart. No individual should think that here in America, when you're going to a store, you have a weapon that can kill hundreds of people within minutes. And the truth is that today, so many of us as Latinos, and I know in our Jewish community, you've experienced this for decades and decades, when we're going to a public space, literally the moment we get out of our car, we have to look at our surrounding. When we walk into our store, we're looking at the closest exit or where can we hide, because we don't know what will happen next and because we're still targets today. And so we also, I want to say, Deb, understand that we're living right now in a movement of Black Lives Matter, where we absolutely outcry the rights of our community and the African American community. We're living right now in a moment where we're still seeing massive inequities in terms of women in America. We earn less as Latinas than any other woman in America. And we want to make sure that as we look to the future, especially this November 3rd, our biggest call to action is that we turn out to vote. We are completely nonpartisan, but we also understand that when there are elected officials in power who do not value us as human beings, who disrespect us every single day, whether it's on Twitter or on a media outlet, or who downright say that our children are not going to come down with COVID-19, when we know that if you're not wearing a mask and you're not social distancing and you're not washing your hands, all of America is exposed. We want to make sure we carry that message that absolutely this November 3rd, it's important that we all vote. And more than that, Deb, and I think it was Dr. Martin Luther King who said this, that we're tired. We're tired of facing racism. We're tired of being victims, and we're tired of being targeted because of the color of our skin. And so we want definitely to make sure that as we look to the future, we continue to work across communities. And I did want to say thank you. Thank you so much as an immigrant on behalf of my Latino community to our Jewish allies who I know have been targeted, who I know have been fighting for our refugees and for our immigrant community, because we could not do this without you. And just know that we are watching. We know that you're with us. And as an immigrant, as someone that was brought to this country undocumented at the age of 1, we know that there are better policies that can be done in America. And our hope is that corporate America is taking notice, that they stop the hate for profit. We hope that one day we will have a Latino president in the White House. And we hope surely that as we look at the makeup of Congress in the future, that more communities of color will be at the table.
Thank you for that. And all three of you, you were passionate and powerful, and your leadership is something to be admired, and we are all grateful. I wish we could talk all afternoon, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us today and for being so honest and open and making this personal for every single person on this call. Thank you. And with that, that's going to conclude today's Fighting Hate from Home. We will be back later this month on August 20th for the next installment. So please keep an eye on your inbox for more information. And until then, please be safe and continue to be well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias.